Okay, welcome back. Now this video is going to be a little different. What we're going to do is we're just going to do a review for the midterm. So, to start off with, I give you a list of topics. So, go to Blackboard, poke down here, and then there'll be this little text file. And so take a look at this text file because this is going to give you everything you ever wanted to know. Alright, let's begin. So, the midterm, of course, is going to cover the first half of the course. That makes sense. Since this is, a Blackboard course, right? Everything is going to be open notes, open book, open everything. Now, the way it works is I create a test pool of 50 questions, but you're only going to get 40 questions out of the pool. So we're still going to have to review all 50 because I have no way of knowing which 40 you're going to get. So the way it works is the computer's going to pick 40 questions, and they're going to pick them in any order it wants. So they're not going to be chapter 1 comes first, none of that. So it's going to be a little confusing because you're going to be jumping around topic to topic. Okay. In addition to the 40 questions, I actually have 2 extra point questions. So I guess that makes it 42 questions on the exam. But of course, the extra credits are optional, right? Okay. I'm including chapter and page numbers here. Now, just want to caution you, this is to help you study, all right, to find out what I'm talking about. But that does not mean that the question came from that page. And furthermore, it does not mean that the answer is going to be on that page. I mean, it's just a point of reference to give you some thinking. Now, a lot of the questions are not in the book at all, so you might think, well, if it's not in the book, then what page number would I put down, right? So I put a page number that's the closest. Or, for example, they may have a paragraph, and I expanded it a bunch in lecture, so I'm going to point to where that paragraph is. But clearly it's not going to have the material in the book because it's not in the book. Okay, so that's the whole caution about the in-book thing. And somewhere between 10 and 20% of the questions are either things that were not adequately covered in the book or not covered at all in the book, and so it's supplemented by lecture. So once again, if you decide to do this whole thing without watching the videos, probably the best you're going to make on the test is an 80 because 20% of the material you won't have. Okay, this is a timed test. You have to do it in one setting, and you have 2 hours to do. It's not that complicated. Most people do these tests in about 45 minutes to an hour. Okay, let's begin. Okay, so the first question is talking about computer operations. Now, this is a chapter 1 question. So, for example, I'm not going to be asking about like the functions of the operating system because that would have been some other chapter, right? So, the chapter number gives a little bit of context to the question. So even though they won't appear in any order, you'll be able to tell in the test, you'll be able to tell what chapter the question came from. Okay. So in this particular case, I'm going to be asking you something about the major computer operations. And again, I'm not talking about CPU and RAM and storage. I'm talking about just the high-level concepts. Data versus information, I think we kind of beat that one. Data being kind of the raw stuff, and the cooked stuff is information. Memory versus storage. Okay, you remember we talked about how we have transient storage and permanent storage, and the difference between the random access memory chips in your machine and versus hard drives and thumb drives and things of that nature. So the difference between memory and storage. The term downloading is often used incorrectly, and I'm going to give you a scenario and ask you, is that downloading or not? Cool? All right, the next one talks about the internet and the web. Remember how we talked about how one is a subset of the other? Okay, cool. Environmental issues. This kind of goes back to that green computing thing about the toxic materials used in manufacture, toxic materials that are in the machine, lower power, lower heat, user serviceable parts, all those kinds of things. The next one's going to be talking about the bundling. And what I'm talking about is if I go and buy a brand new computer today, a Windows-based computer today, what's it going to come with? Is it going to come with Notepad? Is it going to come with Microsoft Word? Is it going to come with, all these other things? So what gets typically bundled together when you purchase a machine? The next one is going to be on, remember now, this test is going to cover both the textbook stuff and the lectures for doing Microsoft Office. And so one of the questions here is from chapter OFF, dealing with the backstage. So if I go into a typical Microsoft Office application and I get to the backstage, I might ask you, how do you get to the backstage? Or I might ask you, what can you do when you get there? That'd be a good question. Okay, the next one's talking about the internet, and I may ask you some more questions. So now this is a chapter 2 question on the internet. And if you recall, I didn't actually like their definition. I thought their definition was lacking. The next one's talking about Wi-Fi, and we may be talking about the technology, we may be talking about the term, we may be talking about trademark, we may be talking about lots of different things. So kind of brush up on everything there is to know about Wi-Fi. The next talks about the domain naming system, DNS. And I gave you an analogy on how this thing works with reference to a different type of technology. And if you can remember that analogy, I think you'd be good to go for this test question. Okay, the next one talks about Web 2.0. And, what the heck does that mean? Because that is an overhyped marketing term for the most part. But it actually has a meaning, and so if you knew what that meaning was, you'd be in good shape to answer this question. Cool. Web publishing, I'm not going to ask you how to do web publishing, but I might ask you about one or two of the steps involved. For example, how do I create a web page, and how do I transfer it, and how do I do hosting a web page, things of that nature. Broad brush kinds of things, not technical, but just what are the steps and how does it work and what do I have to do? What is a typical scenario for developing a web page? Next we're going to talk about browser plugins. You know how like if you go to a website and you may need a Java plugin, or you may need a QuickTime plugin, or you may need all these other types of plugins for Flash Player and things of that nature. So I'm going to ask you a little bit about what are they for, how do they work, and what are the dangers, perhaps, of pulling a plug-in off of a website. Okay, the next handful are all about using Microsoft Word. And so there's no page number because, remember, I made that book optional, so I'm not going to put a page number down here to make you go scramble and go buy the dang book. We're just going to talk about what we did in lecture. And so most of these are kind of sort of simple. The ones with Microsoft Word is an awful lot of like true-false kind of questions. I mean, they're just kind of short, boom, 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 boom. Okay, let's continue. So I'm going to ask you about, what are the options for creating a new paragraph? How does that work? How does it differ between creating a new page or paragraph or getting to the end of the line? How does that function? How does it work? Next, we're going to talk about text styles. Remember how we made something bold. We made it italics. We changed the font size. We changed the color. I'm going to ask you some questions regarding that. Creating a bullet list. You remember how we went in and we did some text and we lit it all up and we made it a bullet list. We could have turned right around and made it a number list and things of that nature. So if you just remember how that works, mechanically, I think you'd be okay. Photographs. When you're inserting a photograph into a Word document, I added an extra step that really wasn't in the textbook, and I'm kind of going to want you to kind of remember that part. What extra thing do you do after you've got the image exactly the way you want it? You've got it centered, you've got it cropped, you've got it tweaked, you've got a border. And when I'm done with all that, then what do I do next? Okay, let's continue. I really like those little buyer's guide there in chapter 3. They had a desktop buyer's guide and a laptop buyer's guide and a little mobile device buyer's guide. So I'm going to ask you some specific questions about the one dealing with the mobile computer, laptop kind of a scenario. I'm going to ask you a particular question that we talked about in lecture. Thin client, if you recall, I went on about how thin clients have kind of sort of made a resurgence recently, and if you understood why that might be the case. then you'll be able to answer this question without too much trouble. Embedded computers. Embedded computers are absolutely everywhere. And so I'm going to ask you some questions about, how prevalent they are. Give me some examples of where they're being used. Remember the example of the car? How your cruise control and anti-lock brake and, all sat nav and all that stuff all use embedded computers. So if you remember a little bit about that, you'll be okay. Continuing on, the difference between a port and a connector, I think that's pretty straightforward. We're talking about, the hole you plug it into and the end of the cable, right? Near field communication. This is something that's relatively new, predominantly on phones. And in other countries and other areas, it's very prevalent for as a substitute for a credit card or debit card, where you actually pay for a service using near field communication. So I'm going to ask you a little bit of nothing technical, but just a little bit about, what was it designed to do, as an example. Okay, the next one talks about the surge protector. You know how you go to Walmart and you can buy a little goofy surge protector and plug it in, and it'll really help you keep your computer equipment, in some cases not even computer equipment, safe from certain types of electrical disturbances. And then if you want to go beyond that, you might have to get an uninterrupted power supply, a UPS battery backup, if you wanted to go that far. So I'm going to ask you some questions essentially related to a UPS versus a surge protector. Okay, that's kind of sort of what the question is going to be. The next one is a Chapter 4 question talking about the difference between an application and an app. And, it's a lot of this is slang, and so I'm going to ask you some questions on, what's the difference between the two terms, if any. The next one is software acquisition. And I kind of went off on a long tangent on this. I mean, it was about 3/4 of a page in the book talking about software acquisition, and I went on and on and on, all different things about that. So you really got to be paying attention to the lecture. I hope you guys took notes. So I'm going to ask you some questions about, how does freeware and shareware and, how does, free and open source and, how prevalent is it used and things of that nature. I'm going to ask you all sorts of information that was discussed in the video. I actually have 2 questions on that topic. So I just have, software acquisition and software acquisition 2. So I'm going to ask you some questions about, public domain and all those kinds of things. So once again, if you can remember from the lecture, you'll be okay. The next one talks about web applications. And we talked about things like if I have a choice to deploy software in a corporate environment on individual PCs, or if I have a choice to put it on a web server for corporate users. What would be the advantage, for example, to do one versus the other? That would be a good question. And then public domain again, what are the rules for doing public domain? That'd be a good question. Let me scroll this little guy up. Okay. We talked about, when there's kind of like a threshold, so to speak, that I use when I'm working with data. Sometimes I'll have data in a flat file system. It might be in, Notepad. It might be in OneNote. It might be in Excel. And then I'll reach some point where I think, okay, I need to put this in a database. What was that threshold that we talked about? How do I kind of, what's the guidelines that I would tell people of when to stay in a flat file versus when to go to a relational database? What was the threshold to make that decision? If you remember that, you'll be in good shape. The next one talks about Microsoft Update. Recall we talked about how, Microsoft Update is a pretty cool tool, but you might have to supplement it with some other tools for some reason. Maybe you can remember if you go back and look at the video. Okay, this is probably a good place to stop at the 15-minute mark. We'll pick this thing up again in just a few.